Tabor. I think I've met most of you at one meeting or another. I volunteer with a nonprofit organization called DNA Adoption. And the mission of the organization, is it on?
It is. It's recording.
The mission of the organization is to help individuals with unknown parentage use DNA and traditional means to find their birth families. So what I'm going to do tonight is share a very brief overview. It's a very detailed topic, and we could spend hours and hours and hours, which we don't have tonight, covering it. So my plan tonight is just to give a brief overview of the process, to give you some hints about some tools that you might find useful. Even if you're not doing an adoption search, there are good tools that can be used just to try to break through a genealogical brick wall, for instance. I know that you're probably going to have some questions. If you can just jot those down, and then at the end, we'll reserve some time to try to address some questions. So ISOC is the International Society for Genetic Genealogy, and they have some guidelines on presentations, two of which are important for tonight. One is that you redact and make private any living individual unless you have their permission to share their name and likeness. And so any you see tonight that I name or show their picture, I've either gotten their permission or it's publicly available. And the other issue is that you're supposed to reveal any relationship with testing companies. Well, DNA Adoption has affiliate relationships with all the major testing companies, so that if they refer somebody to testing, then the testing company gives them a small portion back to support the work that they do. And then the other thing is DNA GenCom is a for-profit company that has a close relationship with DNA Adoption, which is a non-profit company. Okay. So, what I'm sharing with you tonight is the process that I use, and if you talk to a different expert in the field, they're going to tell you a slightly different process that they use, but it's roughly the same things, but they might be in slightly different order. The first thing that I tell adoptees when they're getting ready to do a search is you need to investigate what the local laws are, because they're different from state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and certainly country to country. For example, were the adoptions open or closed? Okay, a closed adoption is one in which the birth family and the adopted family don't know who each other are. Okay, an open one is one in which they have that information. In the state of Maryland, for example, original birth certificates were sealed in 1937, and the court records were sealed July 1st, 1947. So if an adoption happened before that time, the information is found in the old equity books that are now at the State Archive. And you can just go and find those. If you have the State Archive do the search for you, it's $35 a search, and that's by county because there's no index that covers the entire state. So it can get pretty pricey if you don't know exactly where the adoption happened. But if you can find the book that it's in, it's right there, unless a judge sealed it for some particular reason for the safety of the individuals involved at the time. Also, you need to find out information about the original birth certificate, often abbreviated OBC. Some states allow all adoptees to get a copy of their original birth certificate, and that's becoming more and more popular as time goes on. I think it's Indiana or Illinois one that's just this week or last week become open. So some states it's all adoptees. Other states like Maryland, it's just certain birth dates can get their original birth certificate. So if it's before 1937, you can get it. If it's after July 1st, 2000, and the adoptee is at least 21 years old, you can get a copy of your original birth certificate. Now ponder that for just a minute, do a little math. How many people do you suppose have been able to successfully get their original birth certificate? Not too many. The only people that would be eligible to do so is those who were older at the time of their adoption. And chances are good that they knew who their parents were anyway. So now, the caveat for that is that birth parents can file a waiver with the state, and then that information cannot be released. So it might be that a child waits the appropriate amount of time, and then they still can't get it because a birth parent said, no, I don't want that information being public. And then there are other states in which there's no provision for getting the original birth certificate at all. In some places, you can get the entire adoption record. Hawaii is very open, and you can get it like that. Then there are other places in which there's a confidential intermediary system, and Maryland has that. It's free to adoptees and birth families. If you want to find your birth family and you are adopted in the state of Maryland, you can register with the confidential intermediary, and they will pull the records. They have access to them, and they'll find out who, what the records say, and if they can identify the birth parents, then they will see if they're still alive. If they're still alive, they'll find them, if they're able to, and ask them, do you want to have contact? And if they agree, then the confidential intermediary will get you all together, and you take it from there. Yes?
I'm sorry, but what if you're, like, I already know who my mother was and father, but they have since passed?
Yeah, different states, it depends. And I'm not, to be honest with you, I'm not sure exactly what Maryland says. But in certain states, there's no provision. If the person is deceased, you can never get it. In other places, if they're deceased and you can prove they're deceased, you can get it. Of course, if you don't know who they were, how are you going to prove they're deceased? And then some places, they'll have a provision like if it's more than 100 years ago, they'll just give it to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Or if the individual would be more than 100 years, they would give it to you.
And when an individual is still alive, it's over 100.
Right, exactly. Also, in certain places, there are adoption-friendly judges. Texas is a closed state, but there's a judge in Dallas who is adoption-friendly. And so for almost any reason you go before him, he will give you your record because he just feels like people have the right to have it. Other places, the judges don't interpret it the same way, and so it doesn't matter what you could need a transplant or bone marrow or something, and they still won't open the record. So it just all depends on the individual who holds that control.
What about Maryland, like Baltimore?
I haven't been involved in an attempt to open the records in Maryland. I've been involved in searches, but we use DNA to find them. Okay. One thing to point out with that was the adoptee, the legal age in Maryland, did you notice? 21, not 18. All right. So how in the world do you know this information if you're an adoptee, right? This is sort of like insider information. So here are some possible sources of information. One is the state government sites in whatever state the adoption took place. And here's the Maryland site that will give you some information, and it's on your handout. Another source of information is search angels. Okay, those are individuals who help others find their birth family at pro bono, for no fee. And they're a wealth of information. Also, there are organizations like DNA Adoption, where I volunteer, where people will give you a lot of good advice. And there are different experts on different states. I'm not actually an expert on Maryland, even though I live here, because my adoption didn't happen in Maryland. I know more about Virginia. And then there's another organization that's on Facebook called DNA Detectives. You might recognize the name CeCe Moore from a popular television show. And so she started this Facebook group that does similar things. It's a closed group, so you have to be a member in order to see the posts. And then there are lots of blogs, and I'm going to share with you at the end of the presentation my favorite blogs. So there's some handouts back there if you want. All right. second step in your search is to request what they call non-identifying information, often abbreviated non-ID. All states, almost all states, have a process to get your non-identifying information, but it varies from state to state. Some places you have to contact your local Department of Human Services or Department of Social Services, whatever they call it. Other places, you have to contact the organization that facilitated the adoption. So Catholic Charities or whatever the organization, the adoption agency would have been. So you have to learn what the local laws are. And it's also, but it's important because it can give you clues, important clues, that can be used to develop a profile of your birth parents. So the sort of information that you typically get from non-ID would be the age of the individual at the time of the adoptee's birth, their ethnicity, their religion, their educational background, their career, if they're old enough to have a career. Also, whether or not the adoptee had siblings prior to the adoption. Where the adoptee was born and when, because sometimes there have been some changes in records and maybe the adoptee didn't even know their actual birth location or birth date. It's not very common, but it does happen from time to time, particularly with some of the more notorious adoption agencies. One important thing to know is that sometimes the non-ID will contain inaccurate or just outright false information. The birth mother was typically the major informant for non-IDs, and there can be a whole host of reasons why a birth mother would give inaccurate information. It could be that, her father was standing over her shoulder when she was being asked these questions and she didn't want to reveal who the birth father was, or something of that. You just never know why somebody says things. A lot of people registered under an alias themselves, so even the birth mother's name is incorrect in all the information. So you just never know. So it's good information, it can give you important clues, but you also have to keep in mind that there might be inaccuracies in that information as well. The third step in a search is to join the relevant registries. So a lot of states have voluntary mutual consent registries, and Maryland has one. It's free in the state of Maryland, but in some states they actually charge you to join it, so you have to learn again what the local rules are. There's also an international registry called the International Soundex Reunion Registry, ISRR. They have a website, but you can't register online. You actually have to fill out a form and send it in snail mail to get registered on that one. I would encourage anyone who's involved in that kind of search to read their instructions carefully, because if you don't do it exactly right, it's going to come right back to you, and it'll just take longer. There's another registry called G's Registry, and this is a widely used, reputable registry as well. That's a voluntary, non-governmental registry. Also, there are regional registries. There's one down in Washington, D.C. for the greater Washington area that is a voluntary registry. And then finally, there are some paid registries. Now, I'm much more hesitant about those paid registries because sometimes they want an enormous fee. Sometimes they'll let you register for free, but to get any information out of it, you have to pay for that information. Or sometimes you have to plop down a big fee just to register, and you may never get any successful information out of it. So I'm a little more hesitant about those. But it's important to register. And what happens with those registries is
it commonly known which ones are good and which ones are bad?
well, the state ones are all good ones, and those specifically that I listed are good. But with the paid ones, I haven't heard about a lot of successful reunions through them. Let's put it that way. And in fact, there are not a lot of successful reunions through the Maryland Voluntary Registry. It happens remarkably infrequently, really. Okay, So the next step in the search is to complete DNA testing. Now, I mentioned earlier that some experts would switch things up. So the Richard Weiss, who's part of DNA adoption, sent me some information at the last hour. So I couldn't get things changed around according to his idea, but he says have people do this first, and then while you're waiting on your results, you go and do all these other things. So that's probably a good piece of advice as well. But with the DNA testing, you want to do what's called fishing in all the ponds. Well, what this means is you don't know where the prize match is going to be, right? Somebody might have only tested at 23andMe, or only tested at Ancestry, or only tested at MyHeritage. And if you don't have your DNA in all those different places, you might not have the critical match that you need to solve your case, right? So that's why we really highly recommend that adoptees get their DNA in all those different databases. But have you noticed the prices on all that stuff?
Mm-hmm.
It can get a little pricey. So I'm going to share with you sort of a strategic way to stretch your dollars if you're involved in a search. The first thing I recommend to people is that you test with Ancestry DNA. And the reason why is because they have over 10 million people in their database. And that means they've tested at Ancestry. And I'd say probably the majority of those individuals are only found at Ancestry. And you cannot transfer your data into Ancestry. The only way you get into that database is if you test with Ancestry. So with that large a segment of the people who have tested, you can't ignore Ancestry. Now, with Ancestry, if you get your results for the first time and the person you're looking for isn't right there immediately, which sometimes happens, then you can download that raw DNA, which is a text file that has numbers and letters in it. And you then upload that compressed file to other sites. One of them is GEDmatch, and the new version of that is Genesis for the new chip. And without getting into a whole lot of it, it's a third-party site where people can compare their DNA. It has a chromosome browser, which lets you look at exactly how you match somebody. Ancestry doesn't have that feature. So it's very helpful if you want to compare your data to somebody else's to be able to see on which chromosome you match. And then Genesis is a new portion of GEDmatch that is for that new chip that 23andMe uses. Then you can also transfer your DNA raw file to some of the DNA companies. For instance, you can take that same file and transfer it to Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and Living DNA for free. Now, if you want to unlock the tools on Family Tree DNA, it'll be a one-time $19 fee. That's nothing compared to paying for the whole test. When I unlocked mine, it was $49. So it's getting more and more economical as time goes on. And currently, Living DNA is free to transfer, but eventually, from what I've read on their site, they're going to start charging. But they're trying to get a large enough database to be able to work out the kinks with their matching. So that's why it's free right now. And if you transfer it now, it'll always be free. If you wait, then there'll probably be a hefty fee, because I tested with them directly, and it was more than twice as expensive as Ancestry. So it's a costly one. All right. Once you've transferred to all those places, you may have all the matches you need to figure out who your birth family is. If you don't, then I would recommend testing with 23andMe. 23andMe also does not accept transfers, so you have to test with them to get in their database. You have choices when you test with them. You can test for Ancestry only, so the matching part, or you can pay about twice as much, about $200, and get Ancestry and the medical information. So are you a carrier for the gene that's related to early onset Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, or all these different kinds of illnesses, and they're constantly adding more reports like that. So you have to make that choice ahead of time. Or you can pay additional money later to add in the medical component if you so choose to. All right. Before you test, though, I would give you a word of caution. And this is for everybody, not just adoptees. When you test, you will likely get some surprises. Some more shocking than others. It's very common for somebody to test and realize they have some misattributed parentage to one or both of their parents. Another thing is that you discover previously unknown close family. You got a match for somebody who has 1,900 centimorgans. Now, for those of you that don't have any experience with this, that means they're either an aunt or uncle, nephew, niece kind of relationship, they're a grandparent-grandchild relationship, or they're half-siblings. Now, how in the world could you have somebody running around that close to you and you not know it until you spit in a tube? You know, that's shocking, right? So you have to be prepared for those kinds of unknown family members that just pop up. Another thing is, particularly for adoptees, you have to be prepared that the birth family you eventually find might not be that perfect, idealized individual that you fantasized about as a child. I know a person who, she was born in a state penitentiary. Her mother was incarcerated for murder. And, you know, she didn't know that until she figured out who her birth mother was. So, you know, that's pretty shocking. And you have to be prepared that you might not find what you're hoping to find. And finally, especially for adoptees or people with unknown parentage, you have to be prepared for potential rejection from the individual you find. Not all birth parents want to be found, and not all half-siblings need an extra sister, you know, or want an extra sister. So you have to be prepared for that. And it hurts. So what I tell adoptees is, look, do a little thought experiment and ask yourself, what's the worst possible case scenario here? And then once you figure that out, ask yourself, well, could I live through that? If the answer is no, don't test, okay, until you've worked through that. If the answer is yes, then go for it and hope you don't get that worst case scenario. But you have to be prepared because you just don't know what you're going to find. Even in a family that you think is perfectly upstanding, there might be some secrets. And there are definitely some keepers of secrets, and you have to figure out, what am I going to do if there is one of those situations, right? All right, so the fifth step, and this could be an easy step or it could be a very complex step depending on your situation, is to learn the search methodology. Okay? Now, more than just adoptees learn and use this methodology. There are donor-conceived individuals running all over the place that are up to that adulthood age now who are starting to use the same methodology to try to figure out who their donors were. There are also foundlings who, there are no records and no non-identifying information for them to use. So that DNA is the only choice they have to try to figure out who their birth family was. There's people just unknown or misattributed parentage, you know, children who never knew who their father was. They knew who their mother was, they were raised by their mother, but they never knew who their father was. And then also there are search angels who were using traditional methods to find adoptees. So they're wanting to learn more about this new innovation called DNA, and so they learn this methodology as well. And then finally, genealogists who have brick walls, and they just want to figure out, you know, who was the parent of this, you know, person who was born in the 1800s, you know, and the courthouse was burned in the Civil War, and so there are no records, you know, that kind of thing. All right. So I don't have time in this brief presentation to get into all the nitty-gritty about how you actually conduct the search and the methodology. But I wanted to point to you a few tools that I have found to be very useful and will be useful to you, I think, even if you're not involved in an adoption search. So basically, when you're involved in an adoption search, what you have to do is try to sort your matches into groups, because those different groups tend to be different families. So one might be paternal and the other maternal, right? So Dana Leeds recently had a blog that talked about using color coding to sort your matches. And it's pretty nifty the way it works. You just list all your close matches from second, third cousins, and high fourth cousin matches. You put them all on a list, and you start with the first one. So in this case, Randolph was the first one. And then you click on the shared matches, and you look at all the other DNA matches who belong, your DNA matches, who also match Randolph. And then you color them the same color, okay? Then you come down to the next one that's not colored, so Bob, and then you look at the shared matches with Bob, and you color all those shared matches the same color, and so forth. And you just keep continuing this process until you get them all sorted. If it's your lucky day, then you're going to come up with 4 different colors that don't overlap. And there you have your 4 grandparents. Okay. However, it's not always quite that cut and dry. You know, sometimes there's overlapping because you have an endogamous population or what have you. But if you read the blog, it'll tell you all the nitty-gritty about how to interpret it in case there's overlapping color and whatnot. But that's a very useful blog, I think, for anybody who's just beginning to explore besides just adoptees. Okay? Now, if you read the blogs or hear CC Moore on TV talking about the process that they use, you're going to hear the term triangulation. What in the heck is triangulation? Well, there are 2 basic kinds of triangulation that are used. And basically, it's when you use data from multiple matches to try to identify a common ancestor. Okay? There are 2 different kinds of triangulation that we typically use. One is called pedigree triangulation. And with pedigree triangulation, you're just looking for matches that are your shared matches. Then you're looking at their surnames that are in their trees. And you're looking for common surnames among these different matches, right? And then when you find the common surnames, you build the trees out more. You might go up more and out more, putting in all the siblings and their spouses and everything. And you're looking for the same individual in both trees. And then you can merge those individuals together to have one common ancestor between these 2 matches of yours, right? So if you match both of those people and then you build the tree down to the present time, you're likely to find your birth parent in those descendants of that common ancestor, all right? So that can be done from Ancestry without transferring that data anywhere else, because you're not looking at the chromosome browser at all. The other kind, which is the original way that this methodology got started, was using segment triangulation. And that's where you find overlapping segments of DNA with individuals that are all in common with each other. Now, there's a lot to that methodology, and DNA adoption has classes on how to do all that. But if you're on MyHeritage, they do it for you. If you pull up 2 different individuals on the chromosome browser, it'll show you any segment that is a triangulation segment. And then you can just look at their trees to try to find those common names. And again, that also works for the brick wall. You know, you find individuals that you're pretty sure are coming from that branch of your tree, and then you look for the same sort of situation. Okay. A couple tools that are helpful. So when you're doing that triangulation, you're going to be developing hypotheses about who your birth parent might be. And then once you are in that process, some helpful tools help you really get a better understanding of how close a relationship might be. On Ancestry, if you get your results, there's a little eye, that's a little black eye. You have to click on that and it'll tell you how many centimorgans and how many segments you share. Well, and then it'll tell you second cousin, or maybe second to fourth cousin, okay? But that could be a first cousin once removed, that could be a second cousin, it could be lots of different things. So these two tools, the Relationship Estimator app from DNA Adoption, as well as the Shared Centimorgan project from DNA Painter tools, both give you a much finer grain estimate of what those relationships might be. So with the Relationship Estimator, you select whatever the source is of the match, and then you tell the total centimorgans, the longest segment, and the number of segments. You hit calculate, and then it estimates all the possible relationships that are known to have that same data already. Okay? On this Shared Centimorgan project, this is a little different in that all you're using is the total centimorgans that are shared, but then it'll tell you probabilities of all these different relationships. And I know you can't read this right here, but it tells you all the different relationships that it could be. And then the probability of this is 88.1% probability that it's one of these relationships, 9.07% probability it's one of these, and 2.82% probability that it's one of these relationships. And then it shows you the different relationships down on the bottom. Okay? You can check that out. There are full instructions on this site to tell you exactly how to use those. Both of these tools are free. The DNA Painter requires a free membership in order to use their tools. Another tool that's available from DNA Painter is the What Are the Odds tool. And so once you get down to the search where you've identified, let's say you're looking for a birth father, and you've identified 6 or 8 candidates, and you're not sure who it might be. What you do is you build a tree, and you put in that tree the information of the shared matches. So let's say you have a cluster of matches that are all related to each other, okay? But you don't know how you're related to them. So you put this information in there from their common ancestor all the way down, and then you put in this tan area, it's all about the different matches, okay? And the number of centimorgans you share. And then you put in some hypotheses about who or where you might fit in that tree. So some of these hypotheses are impossible according to the probabilities of those shared relationships. Others are possible. The higher the score, the more probable it'll be. And then when you go down to the bottom, it'll actually tell you each relationship and the odds that that person is the correct target. So again, they have a whole page to tell you exactly how to use the tool, but it's very handy when you're trying to figure out where you might fit in a tree with people who are already, are already related, and you know how they're related to each other. Okay? So to summarize the process, this is Karen, and she was one of the co-founders and executive director, vice president of DNA Adoption. She has summarized the search process in this fashion of these 4 steps. Now again, this is very simplistic, but that's how she summarizes it. But basically, if you can identify a common ancestor with multiple matches and you build it down, you're going to discover your family within, below, so to speak, that common ancestor, as descendants of that common ancestor. Now, once you have a good understanding of who you think your birth family is, then you're going to want to communicate that information, right? So the McGuire method is a way to communicate all those relationships and how they interact with each other. It's a way to organize your own thinking, double check your proposed relationships and make sure they fit with the right amount of DNA matching. and as well as to communicate that to a potential match and say, look, I think that we're related in this fashion. Another really important contact or communication is first contact. So what first contact is when you reach out to that proposed birth father for the very first time, right? Or birth mother for the very first time. It's critical to do it right. You only have one opportunity to make a good first impression. And so we strenuously recommend that you do your research ahead of time, that you get the advice of people who have experience doing this, because they can lead you to avoid some common pitfalls and suggest to you methods that have proven to be successful in the past. So a way to get some good advice is to join an organization like DNA Adoption or DNA Detectives. They have guidelines on how to craft your first contact. We recommend that you do it on a snail mail letter that does not have to be signed, but you put it in an envelope that's colorful so it sticks out from the junk mail. Some little tips like that. And you only are going to know those by talking to somebody who has experience doing it. After you make successful contact, hopefully if they're amenable, then you're going to actually have a reunion as an adoptee. Now, it's important to know that not every adoptee wants to have a reunion. That's not the goal of some people. Some people just want medical history, and they don't want to ever meet the individual, and that's fine, that's personal choice. It's also important to realize that not every reunion goes well. We can give tips on how to maximize your potential for it going well, but in the end of the day, you can't control somebody else's behavior. So not all reunions go well. Fortunately, mine did. They went very well. The picture on the left is the first time that my adoptive mother, or my birth mother, met my adoptive family. And so that's my birth mother in the blue shirt, and then me and my adoptive family meeting her. And then this picture is me with my paternal half siblings the first time we all got together. All right. Now, after you have the reunion, so you've worked really hard to get there, and then all of a sudden you're there, and then you have to figure out how do you go forward from there. It's sometimes more complex, than you might think. You have to figure out a way to balance the demands of both potentially your birth family as well as your adoptive family. It's important to me that they all know I care deeply about them, and I don't want to alienate any of them, and I don't want there to be petty jealousies between them. So it is a delicate balancing act to make sure that everybody realizes that everybody's important. Okay? Now, in my situation, they've all been great, but there are situations in which it's challenging. So compromise is really important. And that means from everybody in the adoption triad. And honest, open communication is really important. Some adoptees are very concerned that their birth family might be very clingy, because they relinquished those rights so long ago, and particularly with mothers, a lot of times that was an agonizing situation for them. They didn't want to make that choice, but societal pressures or parents or whatever forced them to make that decision. And so when there's a reunion, they want to make up for the 50 years they lost, right? And so some adoptees are really concerned about, what if, I can't meet the needs of somebody like that. I just don't have enough time. And so some adoptees delay having any kind of reunion because of that very reason. So it's important to be honest and open about what your expectations are on both sides. And then giving it time, In the beginning, my birth mother and I must have communicated via email, 8 or 10 times a day. There's just this flurry of communication. Over time, that's calmed down significantly. But, you know, we still communicate on a regular basis, depending on what's going on in both of our lives, because we're both busy. But you have to find what's comfortable for all people concerned. And then, you know, for some people, they have to let go because the relationship is not working, or there are irreconcilable differences that they just can't get past. So it takes time. A couple other issues to quickly mention. One is for males only. Males have Y DNA. And so that is the patrilineal line, so father to father to father to father, and it can help male adoptees determine their paternal surname. But it doesn't always work, because sometimes enough people haven't tested for you to be able to figure out which surname is the correct one. Also, there can be other issues, like there could be misattributed parentage a generation up that then invalidates the whole process. So, but we're not going to go into all that tonight. That's a whole nother talk. But you have some information there. If you should find yourself in that situation, you can refer back to some guidelines about which kinds of tests to do and all that sort of thing. It's available through FamilyTreeDNA.com. Okay. Another issue, or another kind of DNA, is mitochondrial DNA. Now this passes down through the matrilineal line, so mother to mother and mother to mother. It changes very, very slowly. And so these matches can go back a long way. Because of that, it's typically not very useful in an adoption search, because you might have a match that's from 1,000 years ago. And that's just not going to be helpful figuring out who your mother is. But it can be used, the mitochondrial haplogroup can be used to rule out maternal candidates. I'm working with an adoptee right now, and we've ruled out some people that we thought might have been the mother based on their children have tested at 23andMe and they got an estimate, and it was the wrong haplogroup, so we knew it couldn't have been his mother. Now, 23andMe and living DNA give estimates of the mitochondrial haplogroup at no additional cost. Now, I tested my full mitochondrial DNA before anybody told me not to the tune of almost $300. And when I did, I got a haplogroup of U6A1A1. And then I joined a group for U6, and that administrator helped me to understand that I can tack on another A1. And those A's and 1s, they talk about the branches. And if you go back in time, each branch combines, so that originally there was one group of U people running around. Okay, and you can research that and all. This is not really the point of this talk. But on 23andMe, when I tested with them, they estimated my haplogroup as U6A1. So it was along the right branch. So my point is that it's pretty accurate. From the experts I've talked to, they say it's pretty accurate. It might not pinpoint the exact branchlet you're on, but it'll point you in the right direction. So if you have a maternal candidate that you know would have been something other than U6, you can eliminate them from your search. Okay. When you're doing this whole process, it's important to keep a log of what you're doing, because you forget. You think you won't, but you do. So it's important to keep a daily activity log. And when I was doing my search, and when I'm helping others do their searches, I find it useful to use OneNote files. I use the quick files, and I have 4 different files that I typically have for each search. The first one I just call birth family search, and it just lists what you do every day. Okay, the date and what you've done. The next one, I have a list of all the GEDmatch and DNA sites, the numbers, kit numbers, usernames, passwords, all that stuff, because you get confused and whatever. Another one I do is registries and adoption sites. So when you join, the credentials to get into the site and change it, updates, anything like that. And then finally, I keep one for my research tree. So for each match that I have that's a close match, I add them to an ancestry tree that's private and unsearchable. And I build out their tree, because I'm looking for that common ancestor, right? They might only have their up to their grandparents listed. But I can build that tree out with my research skills a number of generations further. And I'm looking for that common ancestor so that I can then build the tree forward. Well, in Ancestry, if you have a freestanding branch, they're not all visible at the same time. You can only see one freestanding branch at a time until you merge them together, and then you can see both of them. So once you get about 30 trees in there, you can't keep straight who you've added and who you haven't. So it's really important to keep a list of all the matches and the details about those matches. I also, in the tree, will put a DNA icon as their picture, their profile picture. So it jumps out at me, so I know who's the match. So, obviously, we've just scratched the surface here. But there are some sites that you can visit to learn more. And just with the blogs, sometimes, you get misinformation or whatever. These ones that I've listed are very reputable. Particularly with YouTube, you can find some very questionable stuff on YouTube because anybody can upload to YouTube. So it's important to look for names that are well respected in the field of genetic genealogy. Maurice Gleason is one of them that I highly respect, and he's got an Irish accent, so I just love to hear him talk anyway. So, another thing that's very helpful is blogs. This is my list of favorites, and you might not have this one on yours because I don't know what time of the day she printed these. That was one of the suggestions that Richard made at the last moment, so I did go ahead and add it because we wrote, DNA Adoption wrote a guest blog, and it talks about his take on the process on how to do a search.
Can you have that supplied over email?
This slide?
Yeah.
Yeah, we could do that. Yeah. We can just download the whole file and email it to her whole file.
Okay.
She's in. All right. So I know it's really small on your slides, but Kathy will send out the PowerPoint, and that way you'll have it. Okay. All right, and then the next. Okay. Finally, I'd like to suggest that if you're involved in a search, whether you're an adoptee doing a search, or you're just a helpful DNA cousin who's trying to help an adoptee, it's good to join a support group. And two of them that I highly recommend are DNA Adoption, where I volunteer, but also DNA Detectives on Facebook with CC Moore. Those are both very helpful. They can answer a whole range of questions. At DNA Adoption, we have a website, but we also have a Yahoo group that's like a listserv, and you get emails. If you join it, though, don't do it at your work, because sometimes you get 50 emails a day. And you can also put it on a digest, so you only get one email a day. But you can ask advice on first contact. We have people all the time post their draft of their first contact, and they say, what do you think? And then we'll tear it apart, and they'll go back and rip it up and try it again, and keep going through that iterative process until they get something they feel comfortable about sending to that critical match. Okay? Also, you have a bunch of sympathetic listeners, because they're familiar with what you're going through. My friends can listen to me talk about my search, but they've not experienced it. They don't know what it's like. But these people do. And so I can, moan and groan, and they can pat me on the back when I need it. They can kick me in the pants when I need that too, and suggest to me other alternative ways of thinking about situations. And then they can also enthusiastically celebrate with you when you've had that successful reunion. So one comment that I hear say a lot is, it was good to meet someone that looks like me. And I agree. Questions? Yes.
Not a question, but when I first met my mother's side of the family, the only ones that were left were two sisters and a couple aunts and a slew of nieces and nephews.
Uh-huh.
And we did it, I had my adopted side help me.
Uh-huh.
My father even tried to help me when he was alive.
Uh-huh.
But my next challenge is trying to find my father's side of the family. But I do wish I had known about the help,
Right.
you know, in meeting your first contact,
Right.
because we went about it kind of iffy,
Uh-huh.
and I think that would have helped out a lot. My older sister didn't really believe I was related until our aunt, when I hadn't said a word, looked at me and said, "You look like your mother and grandmother."
Mm-hmm.
And then it was confirmed.
Well, you know, it's funny, this is my birth mother, and she didn't have any other biological children, but she adopted two daughters from Korea. And the first time I met the daughters was at Christmas time a couple years ago, and the one lives in Texas, and she and her family were up. And we were sitting around talking after a meal, and I went, well, because they asked me a question about something, and I don't even think about it, but you know, I tend to do that. And the one daughter looks at me, she says, "That's my mother." So evidently my birth mother does that same gesture. Who knows?
Wow.
You know. Any other questions?
You know, it doesn't have anything to do with adoptions, but I know my son decided to go into masonry, and I thought, well, of all the stupid things, you know, why would he want to do that? And his first contest that he was in, he was building a wall with the bricks, and I thought, oh my God, that's my father, because I used to hand my father bricks, and, you know, and it's like, it's there, you know.
A lot of things, I think, a lot more things that we might know are genetically linked, I think. And then meeting my birth family, it has illuminated that more for me.
I just read somewhere that, you know, when people are like, say, afraid of spiders, they think it's genetic through DNA that 1,000 years ago, your ancestors were that why was one person afraid and one person isn't, or you're afraid of some just thing that somebody else is.
We were talking about that earlier, and it doesn't even have to be 1,000 years ago. It could be 2 generations ago. Somebody had a traumatic experience with something. Maybe they fell off a ledge and almost died or something. And that those experiences, those traumatic experiences, can recode your DNA. And then their DNA then could be passed down to your children and their children. And so your child has never had that experience, but for whatever reason, they're just petrified of heights.
Huh.
That article was very interesting. Can't remember where it was
I
now.
got it on one of my feeds.
Yeah. I think it was like a major,
Yeah.
like, you know, the Times or something.
It was really interesting.
So, any other questions? So I know that was a lot of ground to cover, but hopefully it was not so far out in the weeds that I lost you. But we can, you know, certainly at other times delve more deeply into some of the DNA kinds of things. I'd love to, you know, have a group that was a special interest group about DNA, and we could delve into some of that sort of stuff.
You know, on Ancestry, on my husband's tree, more the family, there are people in there, and they have a symbol, and it says 6A or some number. What is that? Does that mean anything?
I think I'm going to pronounce it correctly. It's oftentical relationships, so it has, they number things.
Okay.
All the different relationships. And so that could well be what it is. So that's telling you it's a particular relationship between the person who is creating that tree
And
that individual.
okay. Yeah, 'cause
Kitty
there's a
Munson
few
has-
of them in that,
Mhm.
on his family back, and we don't, well, he didn't even know half of these people were around,
Right.
so.
Kitty Munson, who's on that list of bloggers, she has written about that. And so you can just take a look at her blogs and find out more. I haven't gotten that deeply into that, but it's useful. There are a couple add-ons that you can put in Google that will capture somebody's tree off of Ancestry, for instance. There's one called Pedigree Thief that uses that technology to take someone's tree of a match. And Kitty has blogged about that.
How about when you end up looking like your adopted parents?
Well, interestingly enough, they used to try to match adoptees with families that were of similar characteristics. So for instance, my birth father is 3/4 Irish, right? Well, my adopted father is about half Irish. So, I don't know if they intentionally did that or it just was a happy accident, because my adopted father certainly didn't talk about his Irishness because they'd been in the country since colonial days. He wasn't even necessarily aware of the fact that he was Irish. But since the research I've done, I've found out that he was. And then we tested him, and it sure enough came back that he was about half Irish.
Yeah, because growing up, I was told I looked like my father. And
I had that experience. My sister from my adopted family is not adopted. Okay, she's their biological child. The surprise 4 years after they adopted me, after having been told they'd never had children. So we would be out as a foursome, and people would say to me, "Oh, you look just like your mother, and she looks just like your father." So my mother would say, "Thank you."
then there's the fact that you do the same things, and I just said, oh, it's just osmosis.
Right, you learn behavior. So yeah, how much is genetic and how much is learned? Yeah.
My nephew adopted a child from Korea, and now I think he's 10. But one day he did something, and I said, "Oh my God, he's just like Anthony." And my brother said, "Ernest, he's adopted." I said, "I know he's adopted, but he has Anthony's mannerisms and things."
That is a learning.
And
Yeah.
and I said, Anthony's got dark hair. He's got dark hair. The only difference is the shape of his eyes. He really favors Anthony. But my brother said, I'm not. He said, "Ern, I think you do too much genealogy." I said, "No, I'm not."
Very good. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for allowing me to.
You're welcome. Thank you, Pam, for your time and effort to do this for us.
Hey, Cam. This is how I got to know that I was adopted. My adopted parents wrote down everything,
Oh, yeah.
what my name was, what my father's name was, and then my mother, even to the doctor who